So if you watched my system update video and thought, damn, I don't think there's anything that could have gone wrong that didn't in that build, you'd be wrong. Since releasing that video, I ran into 2 additional issues that I've since corrected, and now I can say, finally, things are up and running as they should be. The 2 issues that I ran into after the release of that video was a failing power supply and a failing PCIe riser cable. Now, if you haven't seen that video and you're having your own issues with your Ryzen build, at the end of this video, I'm going to kind of go over everything that went wrong for me, what caused it, and then how I fixed it or found it. So, you know, if you're only here to see that, then you can go ahead and skip to this time and take a look. Now, back to the system. So things have changed since I initially tested this system. The 32 gigs of 3000 megahertz Trident Z RAM have been removed, and a new kit of Trident Z Neo has been installed in its place with its XMP profile enabled, and it's running at 3600 megahertz. My 3950X is now properly overclocked thanks to a video published by BuildZoid on his channel, Actually Hardcore Overclocking. I won't go into the details or the settings I used, but it's a carbon copy of his recommendations that he made in that video. And the performance gains you get from doing it are noticeable. So I would recommend, if you have a Ryzen, 3rd gen CPU and you want to do some overclocking, go check that out, because it literally will squeeze all the performance possible right out of that build. And I'll leave a comment, or I'll leave a link in the description below to that video. That's not the only thing that changed. One comment I also read was from Timmy Joe, who has a channel, Timmy Joe PC Tech, and he stated, What's the point of having all this cooling, or this custom water cooling, if you're not going to overclock your GPU? And I thought, yeah, all right, what is the point? So I spent some time tinkering around with MSI Afterburner to find out just how far I could push my 2080 Ti. And for my card, the highest clock speed that I was able to obtain reasonably stable was 2100 megahertz, and then I had to dial that down to about 2050 megahertz to make it nice and stable as the core clock, and then I got my memory up to 7600 megahertz, and all that tinkering paid off. Nice, right? Yes, but I do feel the need to add some asterisks around some of these benchmarks. First, the Cinebench score. That score, just shy of 9600, was obtained first thing in the morning on a fresh boot with the coolant at room temperature. This processor, as many of the 3000 series or the Zen 2 processors, are very temperature dependent. As the system gets heat soaked and the coolant warms up, as you run more and more, just use the system during the day, those scores start to go down. I only mention this to make a point that you're going to gain performance by overclocking your Gen 3 Ryzen, but it's going to be very dependent on how good of a cooling solution you have. Secondly, those DCS numbers. DCS, or Digital Combat Simulator, is a flight simulator. and a tough benchmark. For example, on Modern Warfare, I just had to make sure that I recorded the same performance stats, the same performance settings on the same map, and I did the same thing with Overwatch. Easy. And I tried to do that with DCS by flying an instant action mission on my FA-18 Hornet, where I basically it was like a cannon run. You fly close to the ground through some gates. However, since running that mission on my old system setup, and even this one before I got the new RAM and did all the other updates and stuff, DCS released a rather large map texture update, which improved both the looks and the lighting of the terrain, and I also suspect that it made the game harder to render. Because of that update, really this benchmark is pretty much meaningless. I will say though, I did notice while playing that game, it did feel a bit smoother. I was able to fly more precisely, hit more gates, and although the frame rate was lowered, the 1% and 0.1% lows seemed much higher, making the game feel much smoother, more immersive. So regardless of FPS, the game did perform better to me, feel-wise, while playing it. Also, because the game felt more dialed in, I was able to stay closer to the ground and hit more gates, like I said. But also, when you're closer to the ground, you're going to take an FPS hit because you're basically close to the trees, and it takes more resources to render a tree like this than it does like that, if that makes sense. So in a nutshell, all this dicking around did really pay off. It paid off probably the most in DaVinci Resolve, the software I use to edit videos. I'm really happy with how quickly this CPU renders videos. It's taken projects that would normally take my i7 tens of minutes to render down to like a minute or two, which is awesome. And it's crazy how easy I can skim through footage now, make cuts, and it's just how easy and it's just amazing how much time I save by not having to wait for my CPU to catch up with the edits I'm making. But getting to this point was not easy. I've never ever had issues in a system build I've done in the past, so I probably do. So let's talk about what happened to me, what I caused, and what I was just unlucky with. So if you're experiencing any similar issues, maybe this will give you some insight on what you should troubleshoot or next steps. So the first thing that happened to me was after I got everything built and set up, I hit the power button and it was only greeted to a click. The issue I was having is when I flipped on the power button on the back side of my power supply, the RAM would light up, my little display would light up, the button, like the LED for the power button would all light up. But as soon as I hit that power button or that power button, I just get a click and everything shut off. So what happened? Well, I happened. When I tore the system down initially, I placed my power supply off to the side just to get it out of the way, and I put it next to a power supply. Basically, I put it next to an EVGA power supply that I use. You've probably seen it in other videos to power some of these goofy projects I come up with. And when I put everything back together, I inadvertently grabbed and plugged in a peripheral cable. So I basically took an EVGA peripheral cable and plugged it into my Antec power supply, which is a really, really bad thing that can easily brick your system, which I surprisingly had no idea about until making that video and having those issues. So after I figured out that cable shouldn't be in there, replaced it with one of the Antec cables, and things booted up and I thought everything was good to go. So after figuring all that out in an uncomfortably long amount of time, I loaded into the BIOS and noticed that I was only seeing one of the two DIMMs I had populated. So I was basically seeing one RAM stick when I had two in there. So I powered it down, swapped the sticks, and then when I powered it back up, still saw one stick and it was now on the other DIMM. So it was easy to notice that, yes, I unfortunately got a RAM stick or a DIMM module that was DOA. But at the time, given I had an old system that had DDR4, I just pulled that old RAM out, that slower speed RAM, and used it to boot the system, get everything up and running while I waited for that new kit to be, fixed. So after finally getting into Windows and doing some system wipes, so I wiped the whole system to make sure I got all the Intel drivers out, a new fresh install of Windows, everything just felt slow. Programs hung up when they were opening. Occasionally the system would just freeze and I'd have to reset the whole deal. And I wasn't really getting why that was happening. After checking to make sure my BIOS were up to date, I did find that AMD had released a new chipset driver for the X570 motherboard. So I went and got it, downloaded it, and everything seemed to work normal for a while. And I should mention, it was at this time when everything appeared to work normally is when I ran the benchmarks for that last video. But things didn't stay normal for long. It didn't take long for me to notice that things were not as they appeared. For a couple of days, things ran as I expected. I played games, I did video editing, everything was all right. But over time, the system started to have issues. I would just be on doing normal stuff, and it would just kind of lock up out of nowhere. And I'd have to reset it, start again, everything would run normal maybe for the rest of the day, or maybe I'd have another lockup. The following days, it got worse and worse. So I'd get one lockup in one day, then the next day maybe two, and then it just eventually got to the point that I'd boot up and it would freeze or go to a blue screen right away. I eventually tied this issue back to this power supply unit, that Antec one that I was messing around with cables. During my misadventure with those cables, something in that power supply got damaged. This is just speculation. I didn't tear anything apart. And as the system ran, the issue only got worse, and as the power supply, degraded, the power output degraded, and well, those issues with bad power being supplied to my motherboard and the chipset and all that good stuff basically causes all these issues, this blue screen, the lockups, and all that good stuff. Not really good stuff, but all that annoying stuff. At this point, I was like, you know what? I'm not taking any chances. I went out, bought a new power supply, and then just to make sure I didn't get any cables all mixed up, took everything out of that box, only those cables, put it in there, fired it up, and everything was working. At this point, I was feeling weathered, but optimistic that things are good-ish, but after a while, actually I got everything booted up and it was working, and I was like, you know what, now it's time to do some overclocking. During the overclocking process, powering the system out, powering it up, seeing everything change, powering it down, powering it up, I kept getting issues where I would hang up while I was booting, and I would just be to a black screen, nothing would happen, have to reset. And then I got to the point where I couldn't boot to Windows at all, and I figured that I made a mistake in the BIOS, and luckily this board has dual BIOS, so I flipped the switch, tried to fire it back up, nothing. Great. But I kept trying, and I did notice that every time I tried to boot the system up, I would get the same indicator light on my motherboard telling me that there was something wrong with the GPU, and fearing that my Hydro X water block had leaked. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to go check out this other video I made. But knowing that, I was a bit panicked. But before I jumped to conclusions, I decided I would remove my riser cable, plug the card directly in my board, just to make sure that everything, just in case, maybe it was the riser cable, not the card. I didn't want it to be the card. But put the card in the system, hit the power button, everything booted up, and I've since replaced that riser cable, so unlucky. Riser cable just decided that everything else was going wrong. It was out too, but replaced it. Everything is now running good. And in the end, I did a lot of this to myself. Not booting the system outside the case cost me a lot of time. Not keeping my build area clear cost me a power supply unit and more. I basically lost more of my already thinning hair. My dead on arrival dim was just kind of bad luck. There's nothing really you can do about that. And the PCIe riser cable deciding that it was just going to go out where everything else did was a bummer in and of itself. But in the end, I learned some things I didn't. One, don't mix your power supply cables. Seems like I've seen many comments where a lot of other channels have made the same mistake, so I hope that if this stops one person from frying something, it's worth your time. Just don't mix up cables. If you don't even know, if you have a cable and you don't know where it goes to, throw it away. It's not worth your time. And I also learned a lot of great troubleshooting skills and experience that I'm sure will come in handy in the future. So the advice I would give to anyone having issues with a system build is to take your time, think about the issues you're having, start at the most logical problem, and use the process of elimination. That's what I do. You basically use that to dig myself out of any hole. When you get frustrated, like I do at times, take a step back, go do something else, wait till you've cooled down, come back, and look at the problem with fresh eyes. If you're somehow having a problem that I didn't cover, which will be amazing to me since I think everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong, leave a comment down below and hopefully me or somebody else in the community will be able to give you an idea on what to look at next to help you possibly solve your issue. Until next time.